The courtroom was already heavy with tension before the man even reached the podium, the kind of tension that hangs in the air when someone walks in carrying anger instead of facts. And the moment his name was called, he stormed forward, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched, eyes burning with a mixture of frustration and disbelief, as if the room itself had personally wronged him. And when he placed his hands on the wooden podium, he didn't rest them, he slammed them down hard, the sharp crack echoing through the courtroom and causing a ripple of murmurs from the gallery, a few heads turning sharply while the clerk paused mid-breath, and Judge Frank Caprio slowly lifted his eyes, not startled, not offended, just observant, the way a man does when he's seen this behavior 1,000 times and knows exactly what it means. And the man began speaking fast, words tumbling over one another, complaining about unfair tickets, broken systems, officers who don't listen, fines he can't afford, his voice rising with every sentence until it was clear he wasn't really talking to the judge anymore. He was unloading months of bottled resentment at the room itself. And again his hand came down on the podium, harder this time, his knuckles whitening, his breath heavy. And that's when Judge Caprio gently raised one hand, not to interrupt aggressively, not to assert dominance, but to slow the moment down. And in a calm, steady voice that contrasted sharply with the man's agitation, he said, "Sir, I understand you're upset, but slamming the podium isn't going to help me understand you any better." And the courtroom went quiet in that instant, not because the judge demanded silence, but because his tone carried something stronger than authority. It carried patience. And the man froze for half a second, clearly not expecting that response, his mouth slightly open as if he had prepared himself for a confrontation and instead ran into composure. And Judge Caprio leaned forward just slightly, his voice still even, still respectful, explaining that the courtroom wasn't a battlefield, that nobody there was against him, and that if he truly wanted help, the first step was to slow down and speak, not strike wood. And the man's chest rose and fell as the adrenaline began to drain, his anger suddenly looking smaller under the weight of the judge's calm. But his eyes still flickered with resistance, pride wrestling with reason, as he shifted his stance and tightened his grip on the edge of the podium. And it was clear that while the judge had paused the explosion, the real test, whether this man would listen or lash out again, was still just beginning. The man remained frozen at the podium for a moment longer, his hands still gripping the edge as if letting go would cause everything he was holding inside to spill out. And Judge Caprio did not rush him, did not fill the silence with warnings or instructions, because he understood that this was the most important part of the hearing, the moment when anger either hardens into defiance or softens into honesty. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the man loosened his grip, his fingers uncurling one by one, his shoulders dropping just enough to signal that the fight had drained out of him. And when he finally spoke again, his voice no longer surged forward aggressively, but dragged behind him, heavy with fatigue, explaining that he hadn't woken up that morning intending to lose his temper, that every ticket he received felt like proof that the system only noticed him when he made a mistake, never when he did things right. And as he talked, his eyes stopped scanning the room for opposition and instead stayed fixed on the bench, not challenging it, but searching it, as though he wanted confirmation that someone truly heard him. And Judge Caprio listened without interruption, his expression attentive and neutral, not sympathetic in a performative way, but human in a grounded one. And when the man mentioned missed shifts, unexpected expenses, and the pressure of trying to keep everything together while feeling like it was constantly slipping apart, the judge nodded slightly, not in agreement with the behavior, but in recognition of the reality. And when the man admitted, almost under his breath, that slamming the podium wasn't about disrespect, but about feeling powerless, the courtroom felt the weight of that confession, because suddenly the outburst no longer looked like arrogance, but like desperation poorly disguised as aggression. And Judge Caprio finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, explaining that frustration doesn't make someone wrong, but how they express it matters deeply, especially in a place where order exists so fairness can survive. And he reminded the man that the courtroom is one of the few places where people are guaranteed to be heard, regardless of income, background, or status. but that guarantee only holds if respect is maintained. And the man listened closely now, nodding faintly, his earlier resistance replaced with something closer to understanding. And when the judge told him that anger often demands immediate relief, while responsibility demands patience, the man swallowed hard, as if that sentence alone explained years of choices he hadn't known how to articulate. And the judge continued, making it clear that while he could not excuse the behavior, he could acknowledge the circumstances behind it, and that accountability and compassion were not enemies, but partners. And by the time the judge finished speaking, the man no longer looked like someone preparing for another outburst, but like someone absorbing a lesson he didn't realize he needed, standing straighter, breathing steadier. The courtroom no longer feeling like a place of confrontation, but a place of correction, the kind that doesn't humiliate, but recalibrates, setting the stage for a decision that would be guided not by the anger that entered the room, but by the composure that slowly, deliberately replaced it. The fines, not even the man's outburst, but the shift that had occurred when anger finally gave way to reflection, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together as he addressed the man in a voice that was neither soft nor severe, but deliberately measured, explaining that the law exists to create consistency, not cruelty, and that every case that comes before the bench carries two stories, the legal facts written on paper and the human reality standing at the podium. And while the law must always be applied, justice is found in how it is applied. And he went through the record carefully, line by line, acknowledging the violations plainly without dramatizing them, reminding the man that accountability cannot be avoided simply because life becomes overwhelming, because responsibility does not disappear when circumstances grow difficult. But then he shifted, explaining that responsibility also does not require humiliation, that the court is not a place meant to crush people when they stumble, but to correct their direction before mistakes turn into patterns. And the man stood there listening intently, his earlier defensiveness fully gone now, his posture steady, his eyes fixed on the judge with a kind of attention that comes only when someone realizes they are being spoken to rather than spoken down to. And Judge Caprio addressed the earlier outburst directly, stating clearly that slamming the podium was unacceptable, not because it offended the court, but because it undermined the very chance the man had to be understood. And he explained that anger, when it takes control, often speaks louder than truth, drowning out the very message a person is trying to convey, and that learning when to pause is not weakness but discipline, a lesson far more valuable than any fine imposed. And as he continued, he explained the adjustments he was making to the penalties, restructuring payment schedules, reducing certain fees where discretion allowed, offering time instead of immediate burden, but emphasizing that this leniency was not granted out of sympathy alone, nor as a reward for frustration, but because the man ultimately chose to engage with the process rather than fight it, chose to listen rather than escalate, and that choice mattered, because courts cannot help people who refuse to participate in their own accountability. And when the judge finished explaining the ruling, he looked directly at the man and told him something that carried more weight than the decision itself, that everyone who walks into that courtroom arrives carrying something invisible, some heavier than others, but what defines a person is not what they carry in, it is what they choose to carry out. And the man stood silently for a long moment, absorbing those words, his breathing slow and controlled, his hands resting calmly at his sides. And when he finally spoke, it was not to argue or justify, but simply to say, "Thank you," quietly, sincerely, without expectation. And Judge Caprio nodded once in acknowledgement, reminding him that respect is not something the court demands, it is something people give themselves when they decide to rise above the moment. And as the man stepped away from the podium and walked back through the aisle, his movements were different from when he entered, slower, steadier, no longer charged with defiance. And the courtroom returned to its routine rhythm, the clerk calling the next case, papers shuffling, chairs creaking softly. Yet the impact of what had just unfolded lingered in the room, because no dramatic gesture had been needed, no raised voices, no threats of contempt, only patience, clarity, and firm guidance. And the man exited the courtroom not feeling victorious or defeated, but recalibrated, carrying with him a lesson that would extend far beyond the citation itself, that frustration may explain behavior, but only composure earns understanding, and that real authority does not come from force, but from the ability to steady chaos long enough for truth to be heard.